Okay, so you want to buy a cruise ship, float a hotel, fill it with 4,000 people who already paid, sail it somewhere warm, and let the same building earn money in a different ocean every week. The picture is easy to hold. Glass elevators and sun decks. A vessel that sells out 11 months in advance, full of passengers who pay before they board, tip on the way out, and post photographs that sell next season's sailings for you at no cost. Subtract fuel, food, a crew, some port charges, and keep what's left. No property tax. No city council telling you what you can build. And if a market goes soft, you do the one thing no hotel on earth can do. You start the engines and take the entire asset somewhere else. Here is what the deck plan never shows you. Almost none of the money in this business comes from the thing the customer thinks they're buying, and almost none of the risk sits where a normal hotel owner would look for it. The vessel is the least interesting part of the vessel. Let's start with what you think you're buying. You think you're buying a ship. What you're actually buying is a place in a line, and the line is very short. Large modern cruise ships are built in essentially 3 places on the planet: Fincantieri in Italy, Meyer Werft in Germany and its yard in Finland, and Chantier de l'Atlantique in France. That's the list. There is no fourth option that a serious operator can use, because building a floating city with 14 decks, a wastewater plant, redundant propulsion, thousands of cabins, and a fire suppression system that satisfies a dozen flag states is not a thing a yard learns to do in a decade. So the first number you meet is not a price. It's a date. Order a new large ship today, and you're taking delivery in roughly 4 to 6 years, because the slots ahead of you are already sold. That single fact reorganizes the entire industry. You cannot respond to a strong market by adding capacity, because capacity ordered in a boom arrives in whatever the world looks like 5 years later. And you cannot respond to a weak market by cutting capacity, because the ship is already half built and the yard has your money. The price tag on a big new ship runs from several $100 million for a mid-sized vessel to well over $2 billion for the largest ships afloat. Call it $1 billion for a modern large ship with the entertainment infrastructure a mainstream brand needs. Now, nobody writes that check. This is where the business gets strange, in a way that nothing on land quite matches. Cruise ships are financed with export credit. Italy, Germany, France, and Finland all want their shipyards busy, because a yard employs thousands of people and anchors an entire regional supply chain. So the export credit agencies of those countries guarantee the loans that buy the ships their yards build. In practice, that means an operator can finance a very large share of the construction cost, commonly around 80%, over about 12 years, at interest rates that a hotel developer would consider a fantasy, because a European government is standing behind the paper. Understand what that does to the economics. Your cost of capital on $1 billion asset is not set by how good your business is. It's set by how badly a foreign government wants to protect shipbuilding jobs. That's a real advantage, and it explains why this industry keeps ordering ships through cycles that would freeze any other capital-intensive business. It also explains something less comfortable. The money is cheap because the lender is protected, not because the venture is safe. The guarantee sits between the bank and the risk. The risk is still entirely yours. And the payment schedule has a shape you need to see. You're making progress payments to the yard during construction, then the long financing starts at delivery. The ship earns nothing during those years. It is a hole you pour money into while a competitor's ship, ordered 3 years before yours, is already sailing and already taking the customers you modeled. So you take delivery. Now the real number starts. The problem is what it actually costs to hold a ship in the water for 24 hours. Not to sail it profitably, just to have it exist, staffed, fed, insured, and legal. Start with fuel, because fuel is the one cost that behaves like weather. A large cruise ship at normal service speed burns somewhere in the range of 150 to 250 metric tons of fuel per day, depending on size, itinerary, and speed. At $600 a ton, that's between $90,000 and $150,000 of fuel every single day before a passenger has bought anything. And that number is not linear with speed. Fuel burn rises brutally as you push the ship faster. which means the distance between two ports is not a fixed cost. It's a cost you choose every night. Cruise itineraries are designed by people who understand that arriving 6 hours early has a fuel price attached to it. And that price is why your ship crawls overnight and your morning at sea is not a scheduling accident. Then there's the crew, and the crew is where the industry's actual structure shows itself. A mainstream ship carries roughly one crew member for every 2.5 to 3 passengers. A vessel with 4,000 guests is carrying somewhere around 1,400 to 1,600 people who work there. They live on board for contracts that often run 6 to 8 months. You are not staffing a hotel. You are operating a small town where every resident is also an employee, and you provide their housing, their food, their medical care, and their transport home. Here's where it gets interesting, because those wages are not set by the country your passengers come from. They're set by the flag on the back of the ship. Nearly every major cruise ship flies the flag of the Bahamas, Panama, Malta, or a similar registry. The flag is not decoration. The flag state's law governs the labor conditions, the safety inspections, the corporate structure, and the taxes on that vessel, no matter which port it happens to be tied to that morning. A ship departing Miami with American passengers, sold by American travel agents, is legally a piece of the Bahamas that visits Florida. That structure does two enormous things. It lets you hire globally at wage scales unrelated to the ports you sail from, which is why a very large share of crew come from the Philippines, Indonesia, India, and Eastern Europe, and why service staff earn a modest base wage plus a gratuity pool that the passenger pays as a daily charge. And it means that under Section 883 of the U.S. Tax Code, income from the international operation of ships by a qualifying foreign corporation is exempt from U.S. federal income tax. The biggest cruise companies in the world, headquartered in Miami, selling primarily to Americans, pay effectively almost no U.S. corporate income tax on their cruise operations. Legally. Openly. It's in every annual report they publish. So you have cheap government-backed debt, a globally sourced workforce, and a near-zero tax rate. On paper, this looks like one of the best structures anyone has ever assembled. Hold that thought, because the mirror of that structure is the single largest risk in this business, and it doesn't reveal itself until the 1 week you need help. First, finish the daily bill. Food for 5,500 people, 3 or 4 times a day, provisioned in bulk in a port and stored in refrigerated holds. A mainstream ship spends in the neighborhood of $10 to $12 per passenger per day on raw food cost, which sounds trivial until you multiply it by 4,000 guests and 300 sailing days. Port charges, pilotage and tugs at every call, which for a large ship run into tens of thousands of dollars per stop before the passenger tax the destination adds per head. Insurance on a billion-dollar hull carrying 6,000 souls. Entertainment contracts, licensing for the shows, the aquatic theater, the ice rink, waste processing, satellite bandwidth for a ship where connectivity has quietly become a product people complain about loudly. Stack it up, and a large modern ship costs something on the order of $500,000 to $750,000 a day to operate, which sets up the number that actually decides whether you own a good business or a catastrophic one. Every cabin on that ship has a daily cost attached to it, whether or not anyone is standing in it. Run the arithmetic once, and the whole industry starts making sense. Take a ship with 4,000 lower berths and $600,000 of daily operating cost. That's $150 per berth per day just to keep the lights on, before you've paid $1 of interest or written off a cent of the hull. Now sell a 7-night cruise at $900 a person. That's roughly $130 a day of fare, which means the ticket, by itself, does not cover the cost of the bed the passenger is sleeping in. Every mainstream sailing on the water leaves port with the base fare underwater. The ship becomes profitable somewhere between the second drink and the shore excursion. This is where the first trap opens. Because an empty cabin doesn't cost you a fare, it costs you twice. Look at how the money actually arrives. For a mainstream cruise operator, the ticket is roughly 2/3 of revenue, and everything else, drinks packages, shore excursions, the specialty restaurants, the spa, the casino, photography, retail, internet, is roughly the other third. But those 2/3 are not equal thirds. The fare has to carry the fuel, the crew, the food, the ports, and the depreciation on a billion-dollar hull. The onboard revenue arrives on a ship that is already sailing, already staffed, already fueled. Its cost of delivery is a fraction of its price, so the fare is not the profit. The fare is what you spend to get a spending customer into a room, which is why cruise pricing behaves in a way that confuses everyone who books one. As the sailing date approaches and cabins remain unsold, the price collapses. Not because the operator is desperate in the way a failing business is desperate, because a cabin that sails empty produces zero fare and zero onboard spend. And a cabin sold at a humiliating discount still produces a passenger who buys a drinks package, books 2 excursions, and loses $90 in the casino. When you see a 7-night cruise advertised for less than the cost of a rental car for the same week, you're not looking at a mistake. You're looking at a business that has correctly calculated that a body in a bed is worth more than the price of the bed. And it explains the industry's obsession with a metric that sounds like accounting jargon and is actually the whole game: yield per available lower berth day. Every berth, every day, whether occupied or not, is the denominator. You do not measure this business in ships. You measure it in bed nights, and you're trying to raise what each one earns while holding down what each one costs. Occupancy, by the way, routinely exceeds 100% in this industry, and that is not a typo. Capacity is counted on the assumption of 2 people per cabin. Put a 3rd and 4th berth in family cabins, fill them, and the ship runs at 105% or 110%, which tells you something about how thin the margins are on the base fare. You are working very hard to sell the 5th and 6th person in a room, because those people cost you almost nothing in fixed capacity and spend exactly like everybody else. Now here's the other side of the ledger, and it's the part of this business that nobody outside it ever notices. You are running a bank. Cruise passengers book far in advance and pay deposits, then final payment typically 90 days or more before sailing. Multiply that across a fleet sailing every week of the year, and a large operator is permanently holding billions of dollars of customer money for cruises that haven't happened yet. That money sits on the balance sheet as customer deposits, a liability technically, because you owe those people a vacation. But it is cash you hold, interest-free, indefinitely. Because the moment one cruise sails and that liability clears, the next season's deposits have already replaced it. This is negative working capital, and it is one of the most beautiful things in commerce. Your customers finance your operations. You buy fuel with money from a family that sails in March. And in a growing market, the balance never has to be paid down, because bookings grow faster than sailings consume them. It also means something you should sit with for a second. In a business where the customer pays first and the service is delivered later, growth generates cash even when profitability doesn't. A cruise line can look liquid, confident, and expansionary while earning very little on the sailings themselves, because the float is filling faster than the ledger. That works beautifully in one direction. Then the calendar stops. Here is the trap almost nobody sees coming, and it is the one that turned this entire industry inside out in a matter of weeks in 2020. Everything that made your structure elegant runs in reverse the moment ships stop sailing. Those billions in customer deposits are not float anymore. They are a queue of people demanding refunds for cruises that will not happen, all at once, in the same fortnight. The ships don't stop costing money when they stop earning it. A laid-up vessel still needs a skeleton crew, power, maintenance, insurance, and a berth somewhere. And the crew you cannot repatriate because borders are closed are still eating your food on your ship. A stopped cruise ship is not a cost of zero. It is a slightly smaller version of the cost of a sailing one, with none of the revenue. And then you learn what the flag actually means. When the U.S. government assembled emergency support for American industries, the cruise lines headquartered in Florida, the ones that had legally been foreign corporations operating foreign-flagged vessels for decades, did not qualify. The structure that had exempted them from U.S. corporate income tax also exempted them from U.S. rescue. You cannot be a Bahamian company for the tax bill and an American company for the bailout. So they went to the capital markets instead, and the price of money changed character overnight. Carnival raised secured debt at 11.5% in April 2020. The industry collectively took on tens of billions of dollars of new borrowing and issued enormous amounts of stock to survive. And the shareholders who owned those companies before were diluted into a fraction of what they held. The companies survived. The old equity did not survive intact. Nobody sank. Everybody who owned it got much poorer. That's what statelessness costs. It is a real advantage for 29 years out of 30, and it has no floor underneath it in the 30th. Even in normal years, the same asymmetry shows up in smaller ways. The ship must go into dry dock roughly every 2 to 2.5 years for hull work, class inspection, and refurbishment. That's 2 to 4 weeks out of service, at a cost that can run from $10 million for routine work to $50 million or more for a serious refit, plus the revenue of every sailing you canceled to do it. There is no version of this business in which the asset works continuously. You are building a 5-year revenue plan around scheduled periods of pure expense. Now let's talk about the destinations, because the ports have figured out the math too. For decades, the deal with a Caribbean or Mediterranean port was simple. The ship arrives, the passengers spend money ashore, the town gets an economy, the cruise line gets a destination it doesn't have to build. But look at where the passengers' money goes on a port day. They walk off the ship, and the operator would very much prefer they walk off having already bought a shore excursion at a substantial margin, on which the cruise line keeps a large share and the local operator takes the rest. Money spent in an independent shop on the waterfront is money the ship did not touch, which is why the most significant real estate purchases in this industry are not in Miami, they're islands. Cruise lines have spent hundreds of millions of dollars developing private destinations in the Bahamas and Central America, their own beaches, their own piers, their own bars and cabanas and water parks. On a private island call, there is no local economy taking a cut. The passenger's entire day of spending happens inside your business, on land you control, staffed by crew you already employ, at a port that charges you nothing because you are the port. And you have replaced the one variable you could never control, whether the destination is having a good year, a hurricane, a strike, or a political problem, with a piece of coastline that does exactly what your operations manual says. That's the direction the industry moves in whenever it's allowed to, and it's moving that way faster now, because the destinations have started charging rent. Venice banned large cruise ships from its historic center in 2021. Amsterdam, Barcelona, and a growing list of European cities have moved to limit or relocate calls. Alaskan towns have negotiated caps on how many ships can arrive in a single day, because a town of 30,000 does not want 20,000 visitors stepping off 4 hulls on the same Tuesday. Mexico introduced a per-passenger tax on cruise arrivals. The European Union has extended its carbon market to shipping, which means voyages touching EU ports now carry a price on emissions that rises on a published schedule. None of these individually breaks a business. Together, they describe a permanent trend. The destination used to compete for your ship. Increasingly, your ship competes for permission to arrive, and the price of permission only moves one way. Which brings us to how a cruise operator actually dies, because it is not the thing you'd picture. It's not a sinking. Modern large ship casualties are extraordinarily rare, and the industry's insurance and safety regime is built for exactly that tale. It's also not a bad season. Now, a bad season is survivable when your customer pays you 90 days early. What kills operators is the supply that never leaves. When a cruise ship stops being good enough for a mainstream American brand, it does not get scrapped. It gets sold. It goes to a second-tier operator, then to a regional one, then to a market on the other side of the world, and it keeps sailing for another 15 or 20 years at price points that would never have covered its original cost, because the buyer paid a fraction of that cost and has no billion-dollar loan to service. Hulls only truly leave the market in the worst moments. 2020 sent a batch of them to the scrapping beaches at Aliaga in Turkey, and the industry noticed precisely because it is so unusual. So every ship ever built is, functionally, still competing with you. Meanwhile, 3 yards keep delivering new ones ordered 5 years ago by competitors who were feeling optimistic. Capacity in this industry arrives on a schedule set by the past and departs almost never. Your pricing is decided by a fleet you don't own, ordered by people who weren't looking at today's demand, sold to customers who compare a 7-night cruise to every other way of spending a week. And you cannot fix that by being better, because the ship you're competing against on price has already been written down by someone else. Here's the other constraint that quietly caps you. You can move the asset. You cannot move the calendar. Alaska sells from May to September, and nothing sails there in January. The Caribbean is a winter product. The Mediterranean is a summer one. So you reposition. You sail the ship across an ocean twice a year on voyages that fill poorly and price low, burning fuel for a week to relocate a hotel. The famous flexibility of a floating asset is real, and it costs a repositioning cruise every time you use it. So where is the money actually made? Not in the fare. The fare is a customer acquisition cost that the customer happens to pay. Not in the ship, which depreciates on a long schedule toward a residual it will only reach if someone else wants it. The money is in the spread between what a berth earns per day and what a berth costs per day, multiplied by a number of berths large enough that head office, the reservation system, the marketing, and the shoreside organization spread across millions of bed nights instead of thousands. That's why this industry consolidated into a handful of enormous companies operating dozens of brands. Scale isn't vanity here. A single ship with $1 billion of debt and no fleet behind it has to carry its own reservation platform, its own port contracts, its own fuel purchasing, and its own marketing against competitors, amortizing all of that across 40 vessels. One ship is not a small cruise line. One ship is a cruise line with every fixed cost of a large one and none of the volume. And it's why the most profitable square feet on a modern ship are not the cabins. They're the specialty restaurant, the bar, the shop, the spa, and the excursion desk. The places where a passenger who already paid for the week decides to pay again. The last decade of ship design is an answer to exactly one question. How do you build a vessel where more of the day contains something else to buy? The water slides, and the ice rinks, and the go-kart tracks aren't self-indulgence. They're the reason a family chooses this ship over the identical one across the pier. And the fare they choose it at is the fare that has to beat the other operator's fare. The competitive dynamic underneath all of it is simple and unforgiving. The product is remarkably similar across operators. The customer books on price. The capacity can't be reduced. The cost base is mostly fixed and partly set by oil markets and foreign governments. And every operator knows an empty berth is worth less than a nearly free one. That's a business that grows steadily, prints extraordinary cash in good years, and has almost no defense in a bad one except the ability to hold its breath longer than the other guy. If you do decide to buy a cruise ship, understand what you're actually buying. Not a hotel that floats and not a vacation you sell, but a fixed daily cost that sails on a schedule set 5 years ago, financed by a foreign government, staffed under one country's law, taxed under another's, paid for in advance by people who can cancel, and priced by empty cabins on somebody else's ship, leaving the same pier on the same morning. The ocean is free. Everything you built to cross it bills you every day, whether it moves or not.